Okay, so let me just make this texture appear. I'm just going to use the generated output and box, and just, I'm not going to blend it at all, but so we have like a nice looking texture there. And then if we wanted to make it more interesting, we could, I'm just going to duplicate all those. So these are like all our brick nodes. I'm just going to duplicate them, and I could even put a frame around them. So the bottom set of nodes, I'm going to make like a moss texture. So we'll go ground. So on the top it looks like that. On the bottom it looks like this. Let me brighten up the world. So we have two different materials basically, and then I'm just going to mix them. Right? So on the left side, which is 0, this number says 0, and it's this input. We have brick. On the right side, it's totally 1. It's 1. It's totally, it could be visualized as white. It's moss. So I'm going to duplicate these again. And I'm just going to choose another image texture, and that's going to be what I'm going to use to like define the black and white, or the 0 to 1. So we'll go, I just like using grunge textures. It's right. Materials, grunge. So like this rust texture could be good. I'm going to delete. So here's the rust texture, and if you add a converter, color ramp, so you know black is going to be brick, white is going to be moss. So that's kind of, okay, so we have this like complicated, well, semi-complicated node setup, right? Well, let's say I didn't want to spend so much time for the computer to calculate the mixing of these nodes and the lighting of these nodes. What I could do is first, I'm going to turn that into like an image texture as if I like painted that, and then I could save that texture as a picture that I could like reapply to that shape. So I'm going to first unwrap this shape, and for this you don't technically have to like do a clean unwrap, but I think it's kind of fun to do things nicely. So we'll mark a seam, and then I'm just going to unwrap it. And you know, if you do have that add-on, the UV squares add-on, you could do something like that. Another cool tool is called packing. So in the tools, I think it's Control P is the shortcut, but if you just say pack island, select everything, it'll like maximize the space. So you'll get the best resolution when you bake it. So now I need to create like an image slot, because when I bake this texture, I don't want it to like accidentally overwrite my brick texture or overwrite those. I want to keep those intact, or the grunge. So I'm going to say new, and you can choose the resolution. 2048 is decent for mid-range. 4096 would be even better for like close-ups. And I'll just call this like brick moss. And so now I have this like 2K image like slot basically that says brick moss. And if so in the render settings, instead of hitting render, if you scroll down to the bottom, there's at the very bottom, at least within cycles, there's a bake tab. And I don't want to hit that yet, because I want to, within the material, I need to say that I want to convert like all of these into this brick moss texture. So I'm going to select, I just opened up the brick moss image. It's also up here. I could close that window, but I just kind of, it's not too simple, this technique. You need it like I created it up here, and then I brought it within the material, and it's selected. So I have it clicked. Notice whatever node is selected is kind of highlighted in orange. And now I think if I hit bake, it should bake this texture into this slot, and or in this, basically into this image slot. But for simplicity, so the baking is like rendering an image basically. So if I lower the samples, it'll go quicker, but the final result won't be as good. So I lowered the samples just for this example, and I'm just going to hit bake. We'll see how. So this is going a decent speed. So if you, the idea is you would want to bake like a high sample image. So just by baking one at like 500 samples, it would, that first baking process would take like 5 minutes, but then your renders would go a lot quicker. So it's worth like spending 5 minutes baking. But we'll just see. The other thing to notice is this bake type combined. You have other options. So combined would be, it's gonna like, there was a point light somewhere here, and the lighting's kind of just flat, but it is baking those lighting details as well, which you might not want. So I'll show you a quicker way to bake just the texture in a second. So okay, so now we have this really distorted texture, but it's like perfectly tailored to this sphere and that UV map. So, you know, the poles of the sphere, like those are the two spheres, and then it's nicely distorted, like perfectly. And if I were to like plug this this new image texture into like a so I'm plugging it into an emission because I don't need it to calculate lighting anymore. It's basically just making it totally shadeless. Once I bake it, if I quit Blender, I think it says when it's done, like save to an external file. So I'm just going to save a copy and go to desktop, call it Brick Moss. And if you're just looking for the color, you can do a JPEG. If you're going to bake like normal maps or something, you should do PNG and make it 16-bit color depth. But we'll just bake that save image. If you want to bake quicker, and if you just want this like image, these textures without lighting, you could switch these diffuse shaders to be emission shaders. So I'm just hitting Shift S. So now they're emission shaders. So that's the brick, that's the moss. Here's where they mix. And I'm going to select this brick moss texture again, and I'm going to bake the emit. And what's cool about that is you can do one sample pretty much, because it's like it's outputting light for us. It doesn't need to really calculate anything. So I'll hit bake. It basically baked it super quick, and I could save over that. Let me. Okay, so now I have this like really nice. You could even delete all those other nodes right now if you wanted, but let me just take this one step further. So we made that really nice brick moss combination, but let's say we were gonna like, we wanted a full scene or something. So we have this ground plane. I'll just give it a basic texture. Or concrete is good. Okay. Okay. So if I want to bake this whole scene and this like shadow right here, I am going to have to unwrap this plane, and you might want to consider like joining your objects. So now I have, like, if I just hover over the sphere, I have the sphere's UV map, or if I hover over the plane, here's the plane's UV map. So right now they're like overlapping. So the plane is taking up the full space of where it will be baked, and then the sphere is taking up just part of it. So right now, since they're overlapping, I can't bake it because you can't have the brick texture overlapping the asphalt, because one would just overwrite the other side. So what you need to do is, like, let's call in this little data triangle, this is our like object data. There's where we had done vertex groups before. We can make a new UV map, and I'll just call this like final bake. And what I'm going to do is select all of these things and just hit Control P. Make sure you have final bake highlighted. And so now it basically packed them and uses that space as efficiently as possible. If I click back to my original UV map, there's the original unwrapping I did. But now I think I'm going to make a new image texture and say like total scene, and just make it 2048. So here's where it can get kind of confusing. So I want this little camera tab checked on the original UV map, but I want it baked onto this new unwrap that I did. So I leave the camera, because if I hit this render tab, because I changed where the UV layout is of that sphere, it's now in the bottom right corner, so it like messes up because it's reading this texture over here. So basically I want it to calculate this UV map where it was originally, but I want it baked onto this unwrap. I know it's kind of confusing, but I think you guys should just know about it. So, okay, the last thing we need to do, so we want everything to be baked into this like total scene image slot. So right now we actually have two materials. We have this like brick moss, and we have this concrete. This is also kind of confusing, I need to put this total scene image slot into both material, into both materials, so it knows that, oh, the concrete, I want it to put it onto this image slot. So I'm in concrete. I'm going to put texture, image texture, and choose total scene. And I'm going to make sure it's selected. I'm going to choose brick moss. And I'm just going to add the image texture and say total scene. And they're both selected in that. If you had like a ton of material slots to add it to, what you could do is just, you copy it from this one. I have it selected, Control C, go to concrete, Control V, and then I just click it once again to make sure it's selected, and then move on to the next slot. So now I think if I go to bake, I'm going to do combined, and I'm just going to do a sample of like 32, so it's not going to be the greatest, but we'll see how it looks. Let's pause. So here's the bake. We have this interesting image texture. You can see one of the poles, I mean, there's still some texture to it, but it's a lot darker than the other pole, because one pole is being like hit with a point light, and the other pole is not. And then you have the ground with its shadow. You have the sphere. It was flat shading, so it looks kind of jagged. But now what you can do is, I'm going to save this as a total scene. I'm just going to say JPEG. So here's my total scene, my new image texture. If I plug that into an emission shader, and let's do, this was in the brick moss. Notice it's all screwed up, right? That's because it's still looking at that original UV map that took up like the whole space. You know, it took up this whole area. So if I just switch this camera now, like now I want to use the new UV map, which calculates down here. And then let's click this concrete texture. Shader, emission. Okay. So now we're getting like almost real-time rendering, I would say, within cycles, which is pretty cool. But if I move, if you move objects around, like the lighting doesn't change. But now I can, I'm gonna like export a 2K image, so way bigger than we normally do in this class, and do it at, I only need to have like one sample, and I'm just going to use my CPU, which normally would be a slower option, and I think it'll be super fast. So for a 2K image, like basically 4 times the size of the image you guys are usually exporting, it took 5 seconds to render. So that could be one reason why you would want to use baking. And then the other reason is now I have these like image textures exported. So here's like the image texture, and you could go into Blender and say, you know, this model right here, I could say like file, export that model and import it into a new program, and then I would use that image texture in the other program as well. So